All right, awesome. Well, good afternoon. Going to allow a few minutes for a few more folks to be able to trickle in over the course of this hour that we have together. But I wanted to welcome everybody to our community project funding virtual workshop, our webinar with folks from our team, Congressman Brad Schneider's team. We're joined by folks in Washington, D.C. and here in the Lincolnshire office. And really excited that so many folks from across the district are joining us today. Just a few things right off the bat. I'm going to ask folks to keep themselves muted for now. We're going to have an opportunity to do a little bit of a question and answer, or a good chunk of time to do a question and answer. And a lot of that, I'm going to encourage you to use the chat feature to be able to put in some comments or questions, and we'll be sure to get to that. I know folks also RSVP'd on using Eventbrite, and we have those questions. So feel free, if you'd like to ask a question that you already put in there, you're welcome to do that in our chat box. But we have those questions, and I appreciate everybody taking the time to put their thoughts together before joining. So my name is Jake Kaplan. I'm Congressman Brad Schneider's district director based here in Lincolnshire. I want to do a few introductions before we get started, but a big chunk of the presentation is going to be not from me. It's going to be from Tommy Brown, Congressman Brad Schneider's legislative director in DC. You probably know Tommy by now if you've been in part of this process or just worked in our office, but he's fantastic, and I'm excited that he's going to be able to lead us through these slides, and then really shepherd the question and answer the process, and give folks very valuable input and perspective from his experience and from what we know. We're also joined in DC by Madeline Flam, who is joining the process as one of our legislative assistants, and she'll be very integral to the process. We're also joined by Ari Botbull. This is a name you might have seen a lot through your emails. Ari Botbull is our outreach manager here in the Lincolnshire office, working a lot together and out there in the community. So that might be a name you see as well. And then Ivan Gomez here is helping run the slideshow. So he's going to be running and managing tech this afternoon. This is a big team effort. It's a big process, and you're going to be seeing throughout the course of this whole process our names. You're going to be talking to us. So it's a team effort, and I hope that we'll all get a chance to talk about the projects that come through, the applications, questions, answers. You'll be talking to all of us. So I'm really excited about the process, and that's really what I wanted to just to say at the jump. The other thing I wanted to flag before we get started is we're going to have one more webinar for additional questions, additional comment periods. Congressman Schneider is going to be on that call next Monday. It's going to be at 3:30 Monday, March 13th. Everybody who signed up for this webinar will get a link or get a reminder to sign up for that webinar as well. So just want to give folks ample opportunity to join our communications on this and be as helpful as possible. So mark your calendars if you'd like to join that one, 3:30 Monday, March 13th, and you'll get a reminder. But Congressman Schneider will be on that webinar. So without further ado, I'll get this started. Again, feel free, please keep yourselves muted just so we can hear the presentation, and feel free to jump into the chat box if you have any questions or comments that we can start assisting you with. But with that, I'll throw it over to Tommy, who can take it from here.
Thanks, Jake. And we're really excited to get this process underway. For those of you who have been a part of the CPF process the past 2 years, it is a whirlwind, but we're really excited about some of the projects that we've been able to get across the finish line. To elaborate on some of the front end issues that Jake mentioned, I'm going to fly through this slideshow so that we can spend as much time as possible on questions. Later this week, we will be putting out very detailed guidance on our website. And so there may be a number of times throughout today's question and answer where we say, I don't know. But I think the guidance that we're going to be putting out later this week is going to be very instructive. We also want to have a dialogue with individual applicants as you guys have questions. We'll have our contact information on the last slide. So if we don't address something today that you think of later on down the line, please do contact us. But with that, Ivan, if we can go to the next slide. All right, so congressional appropriations, how does it work? Everyone remembers Schoolhouse Rock, talking about the power of the purse. That is appropriations. All federal spending is congressionally appropriated. That generally comes down to mandatory funding, things like Social Security, Medicare, and comes down to discretionary funding. Each year, Congress divvies up how discretionary funding is allocated by passing a series of annual appropriations bills. In the past, there was a process called the earmark process that would allow members and senators to bring specific funding back home for projects in their district. There was that process went on a hiatus for about a decade and came back in FY22. So we're on the third cycle of the community project funding process. Next slide, Ivan. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the broader appropriations process. Each year, members of Congress dictate how much certain federal agencies, certain specific accounts, certain programs can spend each year. These are not project specific. These are for the overall spending amount for accounts. So in our district, an account like TFAP, the Emergency Food Assistance Program that food banks use, Congress dictates the top line funding amount each year in our annual appropriations process. Same goes for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, other programs that we make good use of. That whole process is separate from the community project funding process. That process is going along in parallel. I know we talk with some of you who are advocating for certain funding levels for some of these accounts, but I just want to say at the onset, that process is a separate process that is account specific, not project specific. And so today we're not going to be talking about that process. We're going to be focusing on the community project funding process. Next slide. So as I said, FY22 was the first year of the new community project funding process. In the first year, we were able to submit 15 projects to the House Appropriations Committee for specific projects in our district. Then last year, they raised that number to 15. And for this year going forward, we will be able to submit 15 projects to the House Appropriations Committee. All of those submissions, and we'll say this 19 times just to make sure it's very clear, all submissions must fit the eligibility requirements for the account to which they're applying. And that is where the guidance that we'll be putting out later this week is going to be very, very instructive. If there's only 2 or 3 things to take away from today's webinar, it's you can't fit a round peg in a square hole. The very first thing all applicants need to be doing is reviewing that guidance and making sure that you fit the eligibility of the program to which you're applying. And more information will be coming out in the coming days. Some of those accounts are the same accounts that we had last year. And so we have a pretty good sense of what's eligible. Some of those accounts are new. And so as you're looking at what projects to submit, the very first question I think everyone needs to be asking themselves is, are we eligible for this account? Next slide, please. So that brings us to what is a CPF? So these are all projects submitted by an entity in aisle 10 for federal funding that goes towards a specific purpose in our community. So an entity, it can be governmental, it can be countywide, it can be a municipal government, it can be any taxing body. It can also, in certain circumstances, be nonprofits. We have a list of all of our FY22 and 23 projects on our website. But just to give you a brief list, our one CPF from 2022 helped expand food distribution capacity for the Northern Illinois Food Bank. Another helped establish a workforce development training program at the College of Lake County. Another helped construct a behavioral health campus for Lake County Public Health Department. All of these projects, we're really, really proud of the impact they're having in the community. And if you look at those projects from years past, they should serve as a good model of what types of projects we are looking to fund. So basically, a CPF is any project that fits the eligibility criteria and serves to benefit our community. Next slide, Evan. For those of you who've been through this process before, I want you to pay special attention to this slide. With the Republican majority now in the House, there are a number of very important key differences between the CPF funding cycle this year and the past 2 years. The first is that first bullet point, no applications for accounts in the departments of labor, health and human services, or education. In the past cycles, as many as a third of the projects that were approved used these accounts, and these accounts are no longer eligible for CPF. This was a decision made by the Republican majority, which we're disappointed in. But if these are accounts that your organization is looking to fund a project, these accounts are still open for the Senate congressionally directed spending process, which is their mirror version of CPF. And so if you do want to pursue these accounts, unfortunately, the door is closed on our side of the hill, but we encourage you to get in touch with our Senate counterparts. Last funding cycle, CPF constituted 0.9% of all discretionary funding, and the Republican majority is now capping that at 0.5 of all discretionary funding. What that means is we're still allowed to submit the same number of projects, but we need to expect that either the funding for those projects is going to be lower, or the House Appropriations Committee is going to exercise discretion in not funding all the ones that we submit to them. All that is to say, there's a higher degree of uncertainty about what projects will get funded in the end. The Republican majority has also enacted a requirement for a federal nexus. The committee is only going to fund projects that are tied to a federal authorization law. I think this is going to prove to be a pretty specific citation that folks will need to make in their application. And because this is new to the process this year, what I'm going to encourage you to do is look at the guidance that we put out later this week that will be very clear on how to meet that requirement. I think that'll be a gatekeeping requirement for projects. If you cannot prove a federal nexus, I think it will be challenging to prove that you're eligible for a given account. They have also prohibited memorials, commemorations, museums, healthcare facilities, or entertainment facilities as eligible projects. So these projects will not be funded even if we submit them to the committee. Like I said, on the funding side, the majority is expected to have a greater degree of discretion in scrutinizing projects. We might not get all the projects that we submit, and there's limited guidance on how much funding are capped for each project. The last two items, one is there's a much greater emphasis on capital expenditures for projects. And so for a number of accounts, programmatic or operational expenses are no longer eligible funding. So the Republican majority wants projects more focused on brick and mortar and capital expenditures than on operational funding. And the last bit is we just ask for your patience because the timeline we're all operating under is much tighter than in years past. But we'll talk about the impact that'll have later on down the line. So again, this process does continue forward from years past, but there are some important changes that the Republican majority has made between last year and this year. Next slide. So this is our tentative deadlines. We will be releasing our CPF eligibility guidance on our website later this week. That will be your roadmap for what is eligible, what accounts to apply to. That will be very detailed and include all the information you need to start compiling your applications. On Monday, a week from yesterday, we will be opening our application portal on the website. You'll be able to find it on the same landing page as where all that guidance is going to be located. We are going to have applications due next Thursday, March 16th. We'll talk about this a little bit later in the presentation. I know that seems like an absolute whirlwind in terms of when, how much time you guys have to submit those. But that is when CPF applications will be due. And the following days, every applicant will have a conversation with members of our DC and district staff about their project to help put it into context, talk through what a priority it is, talk through how complete the project is, where it is along the spectrum of completion. And then we intend to notify everyone by March 31st, who are the finalists and who are the non-finalists. It's also worth noting on this important dates that even once we submit the projects to the House Appropriations Committee, Congress overall needs to pass the funding legislation where these projects are included. And so in years past, there has been a degree of uncertainty about when the projects get across the finish line because Congress wasn't able to pass that funding legislation on time. All that is to say, there's a lot of steps on this process that are outside of our control. And so we just ask for your patience as we keep you posted. Next slide, please. So we talked about this, but later this week, we'll be issuing guidance on the website, schneider.house.gov/appropriations, that will include all the information you'll need to determine which accounts you'll be applying to and what you will need to do to demonstrate you are eligible. That website will also include a list of all the deadlines we have. It'll include a list of all the years past awards to give you some idea as to what types of projects we've funded in the past. There will also be a section on best practices for putting together a compelling CPF application, which I'll be talking about in just a minute as well. Like I said, the most important part is the account specific guidance and eligibility criteria that everyone will need to prove they fit, as well as links to the individual applications. All of that should be online within the coming day or two. So I know we talked a bit about eligibility. There is going to be eligibility criteria that is account specific. And so I encourage you to look at that guidance. But broadly speaking, only government entities and nonprofit organizations located in our district are eligible for CPF funds. If you are a nonprofit organization that is located in our district and serve folks both in IL-10 and elsewhere, that's okay. But in general, you have to be a government entity or nonprofit organization located in the district. There are some restrictions on what types of nonprofits that are eligible, and there are some account-specific restrictions on nonprofit eligibility. In general, 501c3s are the most widely eligible, and then there's more restrictive criteria for nonprofits outside of the C3 designation. You will be expected to provide your EIN number when applying. To be very clear, for-profit organizations as well as individuals are not eligible for CPF. Most accounts will require some form of local match. We'll go into the details a little bit later, but there are some accounts that require a local match. There are some that don't. So make sure that you're aware of the specifics to the account you're applying. All finalists will be publicly disclosed on our website. So just know that. And there will be very limited eligible operational expenses. The new majority wants these projects to focus mostly on capital expenditures and brick and mortar. Next slide. And Ivan, can you go to the next slide? Sorry, I kind of walked over the general eligibility. So I know I said a lot of this stuff already, but it bears repeating. For-profit organizations are not eligible. There are, we will be having a limitation on the number of submissions individual or groups can submit. If you are a multi-jurisdictional government, you can submit 6 projects. All other entities can submit 3 projects. If you are an organization or government that submits more than 1 project, you will be asked to prioritize your submissions relative to one another, just so that we know what's a higher priority for you all as we consider that. It's also worth noting CPF funding is not fungible. It must go towards the application's expense. It also cannot go towards the reimbursement of costs already incurred. So funds can only be spent in the manner described in your application and can only be forward-looking. They cannot be reimbursements for funds already, costs already incurred. Next slide. So the next few slides are going to talk about best practices for CPF submissions. And I think this is probably where our time is best spent in this webinar. We are going to be putting out details on the specifics of each individual account, but I think these best practices will help you understand what makes for a very compelling CPF application. I think the first, as the first bullet point points out, is it demonstrates impact and readiness. Successful projects from years past have had a community-wide impact, or they serve a high-need population, or they address a long-recognized local priority. The application is able to tell why the project is needed, what purpose it serves, and it puts the project into a context of your organization's mission, so that we on Team Schneider can understand where that project fits within the broader community and ecosystem. It also, the application demonstrates how that project fits within long-term planning. Some of the most successful CPF projects that we funded were items from an organization or a government strategic plan, or were involved in an intergovernmental agreement. Basically things that are almost off the shelf ready. Which leads to that last bullet point. These are for well-established projects. Some of the best applications are where the federal funding is the last piece of the puzzle. Projects don't necessarily need to be shovel ready, but demonstrating that this is a fully baked proposal where all you need is that federal funding, I think makes for a much more compelling application than something you're throwing together just in the coming days. It's also clear, as I've said before, that every application demonstrates that you satisfy the eligibility requirement. The guidance that we put out later this week will have all those details, but as you're looking through what accounts to apply to, you need to know whether or not you're eligible. You need to be able to demonstrate that you are eligible. There are account-specific eligibility requirements, like those two examples listed, and you need to be familiar with the account-specific eligibility requirements as you apply and as you submit your application. Next slide. The two other big variables that make for really good CPF applications are demonstration of community support. Every application, we will ask you to solicit letters of support from community organizations and local elected officials. So have the expectation that that will be part of your process. And other ways that you can demonstrate community support by talking about the history of the project, by demonstrating that it's part of a broader strategic plan. By way of example, one of the projects that we funded in the FY22 cycle, Dady Slow, which was a stormwater management project, had letters of support from the cities involved, like Park City. It had a letter of support from the Illinois Emergency Management Agency. It had a letter of support from the Drainage District. It had a letter of support from a local school that was going to be impacted. They had a compelling application because they were able to demonstrate the community strongly supported that submission. And also, as we said, many of these accounts require a local match. And so you must, as part of that application, if the account requires a local match, you must be able to demonstrate your ability to meet that. You do not need to have the funding on hand or in an escrow account or anything like that. You just need to be able to demonstrate how over the period of the project, you would be able to meet the local match. And that last bullet point, wary of projects that require renewal of funding, is less relevant this year because operational and programmatic funds are not eligible, but it is important to keep in mind that this is 1 year funding, which means it'll be issued in a lump sum and there's not a second bite at the apple. So you should be thinking of these as one-off expenses. Next slide. So these are a couple different accounts that are eligible. Depending on what type of entity you are, you'll want to think about which account makes the most sense. If you're dealing with a flooding issue as a local municipality, looking at the Homeland Security account or looking at the Army Corps account makes sense. If you're a law enforcement agency that wants more funding for training, looking at the DOJ account makes sense. One of the biggest accounts is the Housing and Urban Development Economic Development Initiative account. It has a wide scope of eligibility and a number of entities in our district have made use of that account as well. Much more information that will be coming out in our guidance, but this just gives you a sense of what direction to go. Next slide. So you've heard us saying a lot about the guidance that's going to come out and our application process, and everything is due next Thursday. So what can you be doing now? First, I think reviewing the guidance when it's posted to identify good options and which accounts obviously make sense, but also looking at your strategic plan, looking at different projects that you have in the pipeline that you haven't been able to get funded, looking at projects where the federal funding can play that last piece to get it across the finish line. And start organizing letters of support and contacting our team as you have questions. Our hope is that the guidance we put out in the coming days addresses a lot of the specifics. But as you have any questions, the last slide will have all of our contact information. And again, all applications are due March 16th. Next slide. We talked through what happens after you submit a CPF request, but we will be having interviews with everyone who submits one, and then we'll be having internal discussions with the congressman, and by the 31st, we will have notified all finalists and all non-finalists. And last slide. So we have plenty of time for questions, but here's our contact information if we don't address a question that you have. I know that a lot of the answers we're giving today are contingent on more information to come. And we recognize that this is a very tight timeline for submitting your projects. But our hope is that the projects that are getting funded are not out of thin air. They're projects that have been sitting on the shelf waiting for funding and are well prepared. But we'd love to open the floor to questions. Jake, if you want to walk us through some questions. As folks have questions, submit them into the chat and we can get through them. And then again, feel free to take down our contact information.
Absolutely. No, Tommy, thank you so much for that information. That's a whole lot of information. I really appreciate that. As Tommy mentioned, please, I encourage you, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We'll try to work through as many as we can. But as I mentioned at the front end, this is just the start of the process. We are reachable by email, telephone, throughout this whole process, and we understand that it's such a quick timeline, so we will try to be as responsive as we possibly can to kind of usher folks through the process. So again, if you have questions, put them into the chat, and we'll try to get to them. And a few things, I know it'll maybe sound like we're repeating it, but I think it's very helpful just to make sure that folks are hearing the same thing once or twice. It's certainly helpful to me when I hear that. So one of the questions that was submitted early, and you addressed this, Tommy, was about how close to shovel ready should the application be? Can it be somewhat near the concept level? How close to shovel ready would make it a competitive application?
So the short answer is it depends. For certain projects, the account will require them to be closer to shovel ready. For other projects, especially in the transportation and infrastructure portfolios and accounts, you can use project funding towards design and engineering and other purposes along the spectrum. But I think the biggest question is which account you're applying to. I think, I think that's the shortest answer. Madeline, anything on your end to add to that?
Yeah, specifically on the transportation projects that Tommy was just mentioning, they do have requirements for things like being included in STIP and TIP, and we can get into some of those details more in the guidance and on a specific case-by-case basis. But essentially, just to go over those acronyms, that's the statewide transportation improvement plan or transportation improvement plan. and different things like that. So it can't quite be at the very theoretical concept level, if that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Madeline. Appreciate that. Another question that was both in the chat and submitted early was basically about when the funds should be expected to be available.
Great question. There has been some uncertainty around that in the past few cycles. Once we submit the projects to the House Appropriations Committee, then those projects need to be included in that funding legislation that I talked about, those bigger, broader appropriations bills that need to get passed by Congress by the end of each fiscal year. So until that funding legislation gets across the finish line and is signed into law, everything is on hold. Once that funding legislation does get signed into law, then the federal agencies will reach out to recipients on providing that funding, usually within a few weeks to a few months. For instance, the funding legislation from last year was signed into law in December. And throughout January and February, federal agencies have been reaching out to the awardees on how to disperse that funding. But I think there are certain parts of this process that impact the timeline for disbursement of funds, like Congress passing the overall funding bill, that unfortunately are a bit outside of our control. I think realistically, you can expect funds surely within 12 months, hopefully within 6 months, ideally within 3 months of the legislation being signed into law. But there is going to be a fairly dynamic nature to that timeline, depending on how Congress moves that legislation.
Thanks, Tommy. And wanted to add, yes, these slides, this presentation is being recorded and will be accessible and can be certain slides also could be sent back. And if you have any questions about a certain topic, happy to answer those as well. But this is being recorded. And just another flag to anybody who jumped on late, we're going to have one more webinar next week on Monday at 3:30 p.m. Congressman Schneider will just have a few moments to be able to hop onto that, to go over a few more things, but it'll again be staff led and a great opportunity to answer any other questions or outstanding things that we didn't cover today, or that you still might have thoughts or concerns or comments on. Another question similar to what we were just discussing is basically, is there a cap on funds? Is there a range that you can address about how much that can be requested or expected through the process for an individual project?
So in years past, we knew which accounts were capped at which amount, so that if you awarded a CPF for a certain account, there you could not expect more than X amount of money. Unfortunately, with this cycle now, we do not have caps on the accounts. And so I think what we've told applicants in the past, especially for like big infrastructure projects, is it's really, really helpful if you can walk us through what you would be able to do with funding if you got 100% of what you asked for, but also if you got 50% of what you asked for, or what the minimum threshold for funding would be for you to do something on that project. And so I think we are operating with a high degree of uncertainty about how much these are capped. But I think it is helpful for us to demonstrate to the committee that even if we can't get 100% of an applicant's funding, they would still make good use out of 50%, I think is a helpful thing for us to have in mind.
Thank you, Tommy. A few other questions that I've been seeing are on the topic of reimbursement and whether or not the funds can be utilized for that, or what they might be eligible for if not reimbursement.
CPF cannot, under any circumstances, be used for reimbursement of costs already incurred.
I'm seeing a few other specific questions that I think are helpful to ask to see about qualifications. And Renee asked to, are public library projects, for instance, eligible? She noted that, museums and were listed as ineligible. So something like a public library, they apply under these requirements?
So we have not been told no. I know that's not super helpful, but I think I would look towards the guidance that we put out. But I anticipate that a library project is not ineligible, but we don't yet know how high the committee would prioritize that project.
Great. And sorry about the rapid fire questions and answer period, Tommy, but we're going to keep going. Do you know, do projects need to be completed within the same federal fiscal year in which the funds are granted?
Great question, because this is something of a moving target with the past few years. In federal budgeting terms, we refer to this as 1 year money. That means there's only one outlay of funds in one fiscal year. But there is a great deal of flexibility in the time period over which you have to spend that money. A lot of those time periods are account specific, but for instance, for certain accounts, you have to spend it within 5 years of disbursement. I know Madeline can talk more about how that plays in the transportation and infrastructure projects, but the overall is it's going to be account specific. It does not have to generally be spent within that fiscal year. Madeline, anything else to add?
Yeah, the one thing I'd like to add is that there's also a time period there for recipients of CPF funding to work with the agency that would be doling out those funds to develop a plan for using them and really plan that all out. So there's a time period for that. And then once the expenditures actually happen, there's a time period in which you need to spend those funds down. So it really depends on the account, as Tommy said, but there is some flexibility there.
For a lot of these accounts, they basically operate like guaranteed federal grants, where you'll work with a federal agency on how the funds will be used, and they'll work with you on dispersing it. But yeah, so it's going to be account specific, but there is a process that dictates all that timing.
Thanks. John asked in the chat if the jurisdiction of an organization or a government entity has multiple members of Congress within it, is it encouraged to apply with both members, or would that be duplicative? What's your best advice towards that?
John, that's a great question. We want to make sure that every community has equal access to CPF funds, even if part of their jurisdiction falls between different congressional districts. I think be in touch with our office as you apply. I think that will likely, if one of those projects is a finalist, we would likely have a discussion with the other member of Congress to coordinate on the submission of that project. And so it does not close the door on those submissions by any means. If anything, we want to be as helpful and collaborative as you apply to those. But it might require just an extra conversation to navigate. But they're every bit as eligible as any other project. Does that make sense, Jake?
Yeah, I think that's great. And helpful.
And,
yep, Madeline.
And I'll just jump in with one more point. If you can note that on your application, if you have applied to multiple members of Congress, that's really helpful as a flag for us to know that we should try and coordinate with other offices to see where the project stands in their applications and whatnot.
That's a great note, Madeline. Thank you. Can you speak to, can these funds, I saw this a couple of times in the chat, be used to purchase or acquire new property or a new building?
Short answer is yes, but it is going to be account specific.
And to that note, and you've touched on this, but school districts, for example, are they eligible within the process?
So the Department of Education accounts are no longer eligible. Those accounts could be used towards things like teacher training. So those accounts are not eligible. However, there are some construction accounts that you could look at if you have a capital expenditure like a new building or something like that. And so it is a little bit trickier than in years past, but they're not explicitly excluded.
Great. I encourage anybody else, if you have additional questions, please continue to put them into the chat. I know we have a few minutes remaining to be able to answer them, but really, again, just as a side note, I want to thank everybody for joining us this afternoon, being part of this process. And again, we're looking forward to being part of this, the entire team from the DC and the district team. We're all looking forward to working on these with you. And again, it's a short timeline, so we're all going to be part of it, and we'll be as responsive and helpful as possible to kind of usher in the process. Tommy, if an organization has received some type of award or grant or part of the CPF in the past on a different thing, on a different item, would they be encouraged to apply again in the new fiscal year?
So there's nothing that excludes previous recipients from applying again, but know that it is a competitive process. Last year we had well over 80 applications for 15 slots, and so the fact that an entity has received CPF funding in the past will probably be something we'll consider in the application process. So please feel free to apply, but know that it will be something we'll take into account as we consider applications.
And I think this question already had been answered already, but we definitely want to make sure everybody has the information. Can you provide a quick summary of how much an organization can apply for in terms of funding and any projects that they might have, what kind of cap they should consider, or if any at all?
So we do not have explicit guidance from committee on what the maximum funding an account would have. In the past, we knew that a certain EPA account would only fund 2 million, for instance. We don't have that same information this cycle, but in general, these projects are in the tens to hundreds of thousands to low millions in terms of funding. There are no CPF projects that are getting $12 million or high amounts like that. So keep that in mind. It also is very helpful for us if we know that even though you're asking for a certain amount, you could still make use of 50% of that amount, 20% of that amount. That helps inform our process in terms of submissions to committee. But I regret that there is a pretty high degree of uncertainty in terms of how much funding is capped for each account.
Thanks, Tommy. Andrew asked in the chat if an organization is submitting to the senator's congressional directed spending request, should they also duplicate the project, or should they just attempt to utilize a separate project?
That's a good question. I don't have a very good answer. I think they're separate processes. And so all that we would ask is if you have applied a project in our process as well as in the Senate, just let us know so that we can have a dialogue with our Senate peers about that project. I think senators have much wider discretion in what types of projects they fund. And so for certain projects, it might make the most sense to pursue the Senate process. But I don't think it's our prerogative to tell you which one to do over the other. But please make sure that that is something we're aware of as you apply.
And I'll just jump in with one more piece that, as Tommy noted, we allow people to submit multiple applications. I think our limit is 3 for most stakeholders. And so if you have 2 projects, one that you've also submitted to one of the senators, you can note that that's one that you've sent to them as well, and then also submit that separate project too, because there's no telling how all the different projects that any one member receives will stack up and what priorities they might be working on addressing through their projects.
Thank you, Madeline, for that information. Few more questions, and then we will wrap up. Saritha asked if buildings that are currently being renovated are eligible for funding.
Jay, can you say that one more time? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The vote bell is going off.
Yeah, no problem at all. Saritha asked if buildings that are currently being renovated, if they are eligible for funding.
So buildings that are currently being renovated are every bit as eligible as other projects, but you can't get reimbursed for costs already incurred. So if the building's being renovated, you could not use CPF funds to pay for the already ongoing renovation. But you could use CPF funds to add on an expansion of the renovation or to buy certain machinery or capital expenses associated with the renovation. But you cannot use CPF funds to reimburse already incurred costs.
Okay, I think I have about two more here. Donald asks, is an engineering design for a construction project an eligible component of something like this?
Madeline is probably best equipped to speak to this because in the infrastructure and transportation section, I believe design and engineering is an eligible expense, right, Madeline?
Yes, I believe so, but I can also revisit the guidance and follow up exactly on that question.
And that's kind of what this is all about, right? This is just the start of the conversation, the start of the process. No, it's a sprint. It's the beginning. What I highly recommend is if you haven't already taken down our information, grab it now, screenshot it, save it. All this stuff will also be available on our website, and the links to the website will be live shortly. So if you're going there now, and yes, nothing may be that you may be getting an error page, and that's what it is right now, because we're going to post all the guidance very shortly on the information. So everybody who is RSVP'd for this we'll make sure that you get a note about that information that's going to be live, so you can find it. And also, I encourage you to reach out to us if you have any questions. You have the information here. So screen grab it, but it's also this whole presentation has been recorded to make sure you can go back and replay any bit of it. Again, I wanted just to thank everybody for being part of this. And thank you to Tommy and Madeline from DCU joining us. This is a big team effort, and we're with you all the way. So I'm really excited to get this started and moving it along. You have our information. So this is just, again, the start. Our next webinar on this, even though it's going to be closer to the deadline, will be on Monday, the 13th at 3:30 p.m. The Congressman will be able to join us for a few minutes, and we'll be able to help answer any more questions that you probably have as you've maybe assembled it, but we'll also be available throughout the entire process for you to contact our office and to help in any way we can. Tommy, Madeline, Ari, any last words that you'd like to share before we bring it to the close?
I think just really appreciate the work everyone here does in their own community. We look to CPF as a great opportunity to provide you all with resources to keep fulfilling your mission. We will be putting more information online in the coming days that we hope informs your process. But like Jake said, please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions. And if you're wondering what types of projects make the most sense for this process, I think looking to the awardees from FY22 and FY23 is a good North Star for that.
Great. Tommy, thank you so much. Madeline, Ari, Ivan, thank you all. And we'll certainly be in touch. And again, this is the beginning. So thank you everybody for joining this afternoon, and we'll be in touch soon.